So we're now on Daf Samach Aleph Amid Beis. Makan Kohen. Now the question is, who actually does the Tnufa of the Bikurim? Is it the Baal HaBikurim or is it the Kohen? And the answer is the Gzeir Shov of Yad Yad of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov will teach us that just like in Bikurim, right? What does it say in Bikurim? Let's go back to the pasuk. It says, "V'lokach haKohen, v'lokach haKohen, etc., etc. Miyadecha." So the Kohen receives the kli, that the utensil that has the bikurim in it, and he does tnufa. Afla halon Kohen. So once again, we have a Gzeir Shava that goes in both directions, right? A teaches B and B teaches A, so that the equation between bikurim and shlomim is going to establish that just like shlomim requires tnufa, so too bikurim require tnufa. And the equation between bikurim and shlomim will be that just like in the case of bikurim, it's the Kohen who does tnufa, so too in the case of the shlomim, he also does the tnufa, aflal and Kohen. But 1 second. In the case of shlomim, we require the bala carbon do tnufa. Here he says, Mala halon, in the case of shlomim bailim, afkan bailim. So what is it? Who's doing the tnufa? Both in the case of shalma yochid after shchita, with regard to the imurim and the chazav shok, and with regard to bikurim, who's doing the tnufa? Do we say that just like in bikurim, it says the Kohen is doing whatchamacallit is doing the tnufa, and yet in the case of shlomim, it says that the bailim do tnufa. Okay, so how do we reconcile this contradiction? Kohen miniach yodo tachas yad bailim umenif. Now, as I mentioned to you earlier, this is a big problem because if the Kohen is putting his hands directly under the hands of the bailim, then we have a problem of chatzitza between the hands of the Kohen and the kli that has the bikurim or the emurim and so forth and so on. So according to some, I'm not sure all the Rishonim are going to agree with this, the kli itself that has the bikurim has two parts to it. It has the bottom of the kli, which is called the shulayim. It has the top of the kli with the handles, which is called the oznei kli. And the Kohen will put his hands on the top of the kli and the bailim on the bottom of the kli, and together they'll do tnufa. V'lema nami kedivrei Rabbi Yehuda, right? So, as we said before, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is not the exclusive. He doesn't have an exclusive monopoly on the halacha that bikurim require tnufa. Rabbi Yehuda also agrees to Sanya. Rabbi Yehuda Omer v'hinachto. Right, and we said the word v'hinachto doesn't say anything about tnufa, and yet Rabbi Yehuda holds zu tnufa. Atomer zu tnufa in hanocha. Why don't we take the pasuk literally? You've got to place the bikurim in the tena on the mizbeach, but not tnufa. Kshu omer v'nicho harei hanocha omer. Omanikim v'hinachto. So that Rabbi Yehuda is medayik in the extra tough in the pasuk v'hinachto, in the word v'hinachto. It should have said v'hinicho, and instead it says v'hinachto. Zo tnufa. So again, we don't understand. That's the Gemara is asking. We don't understand. Why do you tell me in the Mishnah that this is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov? And here we have a machlokes. What exactly the Gemara means, Rava? What does he mean? Pasabo hakosav tchila. So Rashi explains that pasabo hakosav tchila because the pasuk of Yad appears before the pasuk of Inachto, right? Again, what the pasuk says, it says "V'lokach hakohen atena miyadecha," and then it says "V'hinachto," "V'hinicho." So since the word Yadecha appears early in the pasuk, and that was the base of the Gzera Shava, from Yad in Bikurim to Yad in Shlamim, which Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov presented, and therefore we're going to mention him first. But other Mefarshim, right? Whereas Rabbi Yehuda is going to derive from the next word in the pasuk V'inicho. Oh, actually, V'hanachto, I think, is in another pasuk. Let me just make sure that I got that right. Oh, yeah. V'inachto is in a different pasuk. Yeah. So we're in Perek Chavav of Sefer Dvarim. That's called Kitavo. And if you take a look in that Perek, in pasuk Dalid, it says V'lakacha Kohen Hatenim Yadecha V'inicho, without the extra tov. And then if you fast forward by 6 psukim to pasuk Yud, then it says V'inachto. So that's Rabbi Yehuda's drasha based on the pasuk Yud, whereas Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is based on pasuk Dalid. So therefore they mention in the Mishnah Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. That's a very technical answer. But others say that what the Gemara says, Pasach Bo Tchila, means that we always accept the view of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Rav Nachman Yitzchak Omar Hol Rav Gavri. Oh, that fits in better with the pshat of Rav Nachman that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is very powerful. We always paskin like his logic is very vital. The Mishnah says Ve'murei Shalmei Yochi v'Chazer v'Shok Shalom Echad Anoshim v'Echad Anoshim b'Yisrael v'Lo B'Acherim Ma'ika Omar Rabbi Yudachi Komar Echad Anoshim v'Echad Anoshim Karbonom Ta'un Tnufa. So again, even a carbon of an Isha requires Tnufa. But Tnufa, Atzma, be Yisrael. The actual Tnufa is implemented by the Kohen and not by the Isha. Avalobi de Noshim. And here too we have a gigantic machlokas. Because some say that the Isha also has to do Tnufa. But it's not so tzniistic, for the Kohen to put his hands underneath the hands of the woman in order to do Tnufa of the Bikurim, so that maybe will require that the Isha do Tnufa on the bottom of the Kli and the Kohen on the top of the Kli. Tana Rabbanan, we learned in the Brisa, Bnei Yisrael menifim, v'yeina oved kol chavim menichim. And here we have again a machlokas rishonim. What does this mean? Does it mean that if a guy brings a carbon shlamim, there's no tnuf at all, or does it mean that the tnuf is done by the Kohen? And it's a drasha b'nei Yisrael menifim, right? B'nei Yisrael menifim. Let's read the pasuk. It's Perek Zayin pasuk Chav Tes. Daber b'nei Yisrael imam akav zevach shlomav lashem yovi es karbono lashem zevach shlomim. So it says b'nei Yisrael, and the Gemara is going to exclude 2 categories from the miut of b'nei Yisrael. Number 1, ein ovdei kochavim benifim, and number 2, b'nei Yisrael benifim ve'ein hanoshim benifos. So again, according to many Rishonim, the Balei Tosfos, it doesn't mean literally that ein anoshim benifos. In the case of akum, it could be ein akum benifim. The carbon doesn't require tnufa at all. But in the case of noshim, the carbon requires tnufa. Now, what's the difference between noshim and if they're both excluded from Bnei Yisrael? But the answer is that we're talking about Shalmei Yochid. Shalmei Yochid required Tnufa after Shechita for the Chaz of Shok. Now, why is Chaz of Shok different than the rest of the Basar, and you do Tnufa on the Chaz of Shok? Because the rest of the Basar, well, let me start the other way around. Because the Chaz of Shok is designated for the Kohen, only the Kohen. Yisrael can't eat from the chaz v'shok, but the rest of the basar can be eaten by the Yisrael. So that distinction between the chaz v'shok and the rest of the basar is only relevant to a carbon that's brought by Yisrael, because the Yisrael has an iser of eating the chaz v'shok, because that has to be dedicated to the Kohen, but yet he's allowed, and even a she is allowed to eat from her basar of shlamim, but she has to avoid eating from the chaz v'shok. So therefore, there could be tnufa on the chaz v'shok. Not so in the carbon of an akum, because the akum is not allowed to eat at all from the shlamim, not one iota. So therefore, basically, for the akum who brings the carbon, there's no distinction whatsoever between chaz v'shok and the rest of the basar. So therefore, tnufa is completely excluded. But again, you have to be a brisker lamdan here, because there are two dinim in tnufa. There's the ma'aser tnufa, and then the carbon itself needs tnufa, the chefts of the carbon. So it could be that even in even in a carbon of an akum, there may be room to argue that you need tnufa as far as the carbon needs tnufa. Just that the ma'aser tnufa would not be done by the guy. Amar Rabbi Yossi, Matzinu shechalak hakosav ben carbon Yisrael lekarban ovi kochavim lekarban noshim b'smicha. We already have derived that with regard to smicha, there's a difference between a carbon Yisrael and a carbon ovi kochavim, and that's based on a sugya and a pasuk. It says Davar b'nei Yisrael v'samach. Again, at the beginning of the of Vayikra, it says b'nei Yisrael, and then it says v'samach, which means that smicha belongs to b'nei Yisrael, not to akum and not to noshim, because they're not considered b'nei Yisrael. Is yachol nachlok b'tnufa. So once we have in smicha this distinction between b'nei Yisrael and akum, b'nei Yisrael and noshim, shouldn't we make that same distinction with regard to tnufa? Which would mean that noshim are excluded from tnufa. And we say they're not excluded from tnufa. They are excluded from smicha. And now we're saying that maybe women should be excluded not only from smicha, but also from tnufa. Lo. Mali cholak besmicha shasmicha bebailim. Nachlok betnufa shatnufa bekohanim. So I would say the following. Smicha is a din in the gavra. The obligation of the bala korban to be somich. It's not a din in the chefts of the carbon. It's not part of the essential avodah of the carbon. And therefore, with regard to smicha, we could differentiate between bnei Yisrael and bnos Yisrael. But with regard to tnufa is part of the avodah of the kohanim, that the carbon cries out for tnufa. And therefore, we're not going to be machalek between bnei Yisrael, etc. So I'll just read to you what he says here. Since we have no basis to differentiate between the karbanos of male Jews and the karbanos of akum or noshim, we must presume that the offering of an idolater of a woman is also subject to tnufa in Cain. But now we go back to the parasha tnufa. In the parasha tnufa, it says bnei Yisrael in Cain. Ma tabalom bnei Yisrael. Bnei Yisrael menifim v'ein ovi kochav menifim. Bnei Yisrael menifim v'ein hanoshim menifos. So again, the carbon itself needs tnufa. It's not like smicha, because smicha depends upon the bilan. But in tnufa, the carbon itself needs tnufa. So at this point, we're going to understand that although Bnei Yisrael excludes the women and the akum from smicha, that's only as far as the chovas gavra is concerned, meaning the act of smicha will be done not by the guy and not by the isha. But the carbon itself needs smicha, and the carbon itself needs tnufa, and that tnufa will be implemented by the Kohen. Tanya, either we have a brisa. Again, with regard to tnufa, it says Bnei Yisrael, Ainly el b'nei Yisrael. Gerim v'avodim mishuchra minayin. Now this is a pella because a ger, and for that matter, an Eved Meshuchar, who has the same status as a ger, is equal to any other Jew, and he would not be excluded from Bnei Yisrael. But Tamalomer HaMakriv. So the question is, why do we need a special ribui for these? Practically, he says in all laws, the status of a convert and an emancipated Canaanite slave is identical to that of any Jew. And therefore, Bnei Yisrael would exclude, a guy, but it wouldn't exclude a ger. I don't know. Tosus raises this question, but there's no answer to this question. Anyway. Oh, anyway, Ella ze kohen hamakriv. Shu omer yadav tivi ena. Perhaps the Bala Korban here refers to the Kohen, not to the Bailam, because it says Hamakriv. Hamakriv is the Kohen who performs the whatchamacallit, the Trufa. So again, we're talking about Tnufa, and it says Bnei Yisrael, and now we want to include Gerim, Talmud Lomer Hamakriv. How does the word Hamakriv include Gerim? Hamakriv is referring to the Kohen who does Tnufa. Oh, Einu El is that Kohen Hamakriv. Kshu Omer Yadav Tivienu, Harei Bailim. How do we know that Yadav Tivienu is referring to the Bailim? So you have to open up the Chumash here and see the Seder Psukim. But we're not going to do that now. We're just going to ask the question of HaKesad. Once again, if we require Tnufa by the Kohanim and by the Bala Korban, so how do we reconcile that? HaKesad Kohen Miniach Yodav Tachas Yedei Bailim Umenif, and then we have Kesad Osa. So we're going to stop here, and tomorrow's daf is Samach Beis, which will begin with exactly where the Kohanim put their hands and where the Bailim put their hands and which part of the korban needs Tnufa and so forth and so on. So the real nitty-gritty implementation of Tnufa is here on Daf Samach Beis, which means that on Yom Rishon, we're going to have to begin the Mishnah of Nidavos. That's on Daf Samach Gimel. And as a person takes a Nidava to bring a mincha, which mincha he brings, and so forth. So then I'll wish you a great Shabbos and a safe Shabbos, quiet Shabbos. Thank you very much.